One, two, three, four. Pedagogy a go go. Pedagogy go go go. Hello, and welcome to Pedagogy a Go Go, a podcast about college faculty sharing what happens in their classrooms and why. This is Season 3, Episode 6, Making Space Work Better, and we are your hosts, Gina Turner and Tom O'Connor. Happy May, Tom.
Happy May, Gina. Welcome to the last episode of our season. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. We are at the end of our semester, and we are excited to be talking to someone who's not part of the NCC community, but nonetheless has a lot of really interesting stuff to share about being a professor.
We are. I'm so excited for our guest today. And for the record, if you say you're doing good at the end of the semester, Gina, it means you're doing great. Because I'm barely okay, which means that I'm doing good. That's my end of metric for the semester.
I like it.
But yeah, no, we have a very special guest today. Dr. Beck Pooley from Lehigh University is going to be joining us. She's the director of their environmental policy program. She's a professor in their political science department. And I'm super excited both to hear about her experiences in the classroom and what it's like to teach this material. But I'm also just, I don't know about you, but this discipline is way outside of my wheelhouse. But it's also connected to so much of what I teach, because when we talk about urban planning, when we talk about developing and redeveloping, we're talking about issues related to gender, class, food security, politics, all of which are, the bread and butter of the humanities and certainly psychology too. But it's from a perspective that we don't see all too often.
Absolutely. So it will be great to have an expert talk to us about the thought and planning, and then sometimes the not so much planning that goes into the lived spaces that we're in.
Exactly right. So I'm super excited to talk to Dr. Beck Pooley, but before we do, you gave me some homework. Actually, no, it was better than homework. If I'm gonna directly quote you, Gina. You anointed yourself my wellness fairy godmother.
Queen.
No. My wellness fairy godmother, I believe, as I re-listened to the podcast because I wanted to make sure that I was actually did I actually do what was asked of me according to my memory? And I'd like to say I think you're going to be proud. Oh. So just to recap quickly for our audience, you described an assignment you do with your class for them to essentially think about their own mental wellness. Think about
and physical health,
mental and physical health, and kind of set themselves a kind of diary journal, small, like something, a hopefully accomplishable task. But even if they don't accomplish it, they could still get an A in the assignment, was the way it was described to me. But to think about their physical and mental wellness, and we know that that's not my forte. And so I decided when and you were like, what are you going to do, Tom? And I'm like, I don't know. You can't just throw that out and I have a quick answer. So I actually began by spending a lot of time thinking about it. And Becca likes to tell a story about me. And she says, this is the perfect Tom story. This is going to pay off, I promise. And she said, Tom decides one day, 10 years ago, I'm going to get in shape today. So I get the P90X workout, and I decide to queue up the most difficult P90X workout, which is the plyometric workout. Never mind that I have terrible ankles. And I do, first day out, the full 45-minute plyometric workout. I feel exhausted. I go to bed, sleep the sleep of the well-rested. I wake up the next day to go hiking, and I say, let's go hiking and as part of my new wellness journey. And we went to Ringing Rocks, and I stepped out, which is a boulder field. And I stepped out onto the first rock, and I went to jump to the second rock, which was maybe 2 feet away. And my legs and ankles said, no. And I went about 6 inches and fell into a crevice between the rocks where I pretty much broke my ankle. Oh. At which point I woke up the next morning and said, I'm never working out again. So this is the heart of my physical and mental wellness program. And so I said, I need to fix this. So I set myself actually a really large task, and I simply said, I want to do something physical in my backyard that is going to contribute and benefit my life in ways. So it's work I'm going to do to produce something that makes me feel good. And even when I'm finished, there will still be good work to do that I want to continue. And so I have always longed to have a kind of fireplace hearth. And my wife and I moved into a relatively newer house with a gas fireplace. And I had a fire pit in the backyard that you could roast a hot dog or a marshmallow on. But, anyone who listens to the show knows that I love to cook and that's part of my mental wellness. Mm-hmm. And so I set myself a grand task. I said, I'm going to build myself a pizza oven, which was absurd because I know nothing about masonry. And turns out that the fire safe bricks are really, really expensive, and it would have cost like $2,000 just for the bricks themselves, which was great because it set my perspective. And I said, I'm gonna find a way to do this that's fiscally responsible, that doesn't break my back, and that's also something that I can do and feel good about. And so over the last couple of weeks, I went to flea markets. I found a set of antique andirons for $20. I found a really large piece of slate, and I used materials from around my house, and I'd set myself kind of small tasks, throughout days so that I didn't break my back and do a plyometric workout that broke an ankle. Mm-hmm. And I ended up with this incredibly beautiful hearth in my backyard. It looks like the hearth of the gods. It has massive stones around it that I used a cart and kind of trenched up. And it has a cooking area. So I literally, right before our podcast, I went on an Amazon spending spree. And I will send photos. So if any interested listeners want to see the fruits of your homework's labors, I have this great cooking hearth. So that I'm really proud of. It's not a pizza oven, but at the same time, it's something I'm going to cook on, every day, it's something that
I'm so proud of you because you linked this physical activity with many things in your life that you value. You love antiquing, you love cooking, and you wanted to do something that would last after the physical effort. You get an A on this project because you've incorporated, not only did you accomplish your goal, but you've incorporated all of the concepts that make a goal doable. Well done.
And I didn't even bring you an apple for our virtual classroom. Thank you, Gina.
Well, thank you for that report. And now let's go ahead and move on to our guest.
All right.
If you had just one word to describe yourself as a teacher, what would it be?
But first, just allow me to begin by welcoming you to our podcast. We are here today with Dr. Karen Beck Pooley from Lehigh University, where she's the director of the Environmental Policy Program and professor of practice in their political science department. Karen, as I was saying to you before we began our podcast today, we're so excited to have you. I know you share an alma mater with my co-host, and you now work where I did my master's and doctoral work and taught for a bit when I was doing so at Lehigh University. But you are also involved in a program that, first of all, we have not had the opportunity to talk with someone with your specific background who teaches in your specific field, but more importantly, the field that you teach in, I think, is specifically meaningful to our population of students at Northampton Community College, right? So let me begin by asking, and we're gonna delve into that. But I am fascinated, Karen, by the program you direct and the coursework you teach at Lehigh. Can you tell us a little bit about both to begin, and tell us, what is it about your discipline that makes you excited to teach it, that drew you to it in the first place?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I direct the Environmental Policy Program. It's an interdisciplinary program, so we have students coming into it who have academic backgrounds kind of all over the place. Some in the natural sciences, some have, come up through political science, some were English majors but care a lot about the environment and want to learn more. And so over the course of our program, students have a chance to sort of catch up in whatever area they didn't get a chance to study as an undergrad, whether that's sort of the sociology, sort of the way we relate as people to the environment, the policy and the legal framework to the environment, and some of the science. People don't have that kind of background. At a certain level, though, it's kind of ironic that I'm directing an environmental policy program because I'm a city planner. And so my environment, the one that I know about, the one that I think about and study and work on, is the built environment. And certainly one thing we've noticed over the course of the last year and a half is the environment broadly defined, not just the natural one, but the built environment in which we live has a huge impact on us. And that's one of the reasons I love to study. That's one of the reasons I study it and work on it. And it's one of the reasons I love to teach it, is because it's a topic that's so accessible that we're all, whether we realize it or not, we're all kind of experts on it to begin with, because it is the place we live in. We inherently know what about that place works, what doesn't, what we like about it, what we don't like about it, what in it makes it easier for us to go about our day or to do the things we need to do. And that's really what city planning is about, figuring out how to intervene in that space to make it work better for the people who live there. But the other thing about neighborhoods, and why I think, that's my environment, is neighborhoods, why I think it's so important to work on those, because really when you think about it, where you go depends on you and sort of how hard you're working and what you're capable of. It depends on your family, because they are your biggest cheerleaders and support network beyond you yourself. But then it absolutely depends on your neighborhood and what kind of opportunities your neighborhood has to offer. So that's another reason I love to think about neighborhoods, work on neighborhoods, and why it's important to teach sort of the behind the scenes, but not really that far back behind the scenes, way in which they work, so that people can get involved in them.
So can I ask you quickly, what are some of the specific courses you're teaching? And I know that in Bethlehem, where Lehigh University is located, and I know that you worked in Allentown and part of their revitalization for many years. And there is a South Side initiative going on in a look to revitalize Bethlehem. Do you involve your students in that process in terms of research or activism or being active in that? And I'm going to just kind of wade in, and I promise I'd start with softballs, but let me ask, in terms of that, Lehigh has a vested interest in that Southside initiative, in terms of, it looks at students live there. They look to the safety of the students and growing that community. But many of the students affected by that revitalization are Northampton students, right? Who we hear from our students who are concerned because their house was bought up by somebody else and they're going to look and rent elsewhere. So there's impacts for Lehigh, there's impacts for other schools, and it sits you squarely in what you're doing in something that's deeply important on both sides. And how do you navigate that? What's that like for your students?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an amazing case study. And, some of the courses I teach on are about sort of thinking about how we invest in places today. Some of them are going over the history of ways in which we've invested in places in the past. And the South Side, where we're sitting as we're having those conversations, is an incredible case study on both of those fronts. It's tricky. The South Side is a place where you've got a lot of different players, a lot of different actors. Some of them are really big. Some of them feel smaller. If you're one student who's living in the neighborhood, versus Lehigh, which is a much bigger actor in the neighborhood. But, the place, if you think about it, works like any ecosystem would, that no one actor gets to make all the decisions. When they do, things start to fall apart and you lose things that you don't realize how much you needed them. And so, one of the biggest challenges in that neighborhood is that you have a lot of really big actors who, when you're big enough, you tend to think that you can sort of, maybe not enlist as many other ideas or opinions or teammates as you're thinking about what might be best for the neighborhood. But that tends to not work well for neighborhoods in the long term, because particularly urban neighborhoods like our neighborhoods in Bethlehem, they sort of rely on a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of things, investing their time and their money and putting their stamp on those places and continuing to put their stamp on those places. And that's really when neighborhoods work best, when they engage a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of different things in the same space. And that's one of the challenges for the South Side, is that you've got some big players in that neighborhood. If that makes any sense.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk about this. And before we started recording, I said that I was a little intimidated because this is so completely outside of my knowledge base in any way, shape, or form. But as I've been listening to you talk, it strikes me how cross-disciplinary your work is. I love the way you describe how these those three different prongs of students that you get, right? Those students interested in the environment, those students who are coming from political science, and so those English majors even, which is really exciting. It must be lead to such fascinating conversations in the classroom. And then I was also thinking, well, that's a lot of what I love about my own discipline, is that I feel like it's the lived environment we're all in, right? You're talking about the streets that we walk every day and drive every day. And when we walk outside of our door, who do we see and what do we see and what resources do we have? In the same ways that as a psychologist, I'm interested in, how all of that and, just what people do in the world. So, of course, I see psychology everywhere, right? It's I have a hammer and my hammer is psychology and everything is. But this kind of brings me in a roundabout way to the next question, which is, I feel like you are synthesizing and integrating so much information and also lived experience for your students. And we like to ask people, if you had just one word to describe yourself as a teacher in the classroom, can you narrow it down to one word or even a phrase? How would you define yourself in the classroom?
It's hard. My word that I was thinking of is probably enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Because this is stuff that I'm very passionate about. And so, I like to shove them to be passionate about too. And usually doesn't take a lot because we're talking, I make a point of talking about the places that they care most about. If we're going to talk about the way places work, I want to talk about places they care about. And so it's easy to sort of get others enthusiastic about the same kind of topic, but it's stuff that I love and I learn from them all the time. So it's one of those things that's sort of constantly new and exciting to me. So I'm thinking it'd be along the lines of enthusiastic.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I get your enthusiasm even just in answering these questions with us here today. And I'm thinking too of what you were saying about, obviously in this past year, looking at the neighborhoods we live in some ways, and maybe from my personal experience, right, working completely from home, the neighborhood I'm in has been a lifeline for me because I have created a social network in my neighborhood. There's the psychologist part of me.
It's important.
Yeah, definitely. So that's another really important element, those shared spaces, right, and within neighborhoods and things like that. So now I want to take a class.
I was going to say shared spaces before you even did. So you know more about city planning than you thought
you did. Well, Karen, your enthusiasm for city planning and what its implications are, right, in an increasingly urban world where people are moving towards that center. And I'm really curious in terms of, and so your enthusiasm for that is clear as you've described yourself that way. And I look at the events of the last year, right, and how they've changed all of us, how they changed the way we teach, and how they've impacted our classrooms specifically, and also our disciplines. And how have the events of the last year changed your classroom? And I guess I'm thinking because, when you talk about urban planning, as you said, it's interdisciplinary. You're talking about class issues, race issues, food insecurity issues, and food deserts, environmentalisms. For once, I hear a dog barking, and it's not mine. And so, no, don't apologize at all. That's what makes this great. You don't need to mute it. He thinks I'm rambling in my question. He wants me to get to the point. That's what's going on here. Believe me, I feel him. So I guess to my point, I mean, like with all of the issues around race, around how urban environments have come alive and are playing a point in changing history and are also epicenters of the pandemic. How has that changed the way you approach the material you teach? Has that changed the classroom dialogues that you have around that material? There's so much there, and every time I think back on the last year, I'm overwhelmed by it. So it's kind of a catch-all question in terms of, how has this last year, changed your classroom?
On one teeny tiny level, We've been fully remote, so it's meant doing this without getting out into the field. So because students are everywhere, some students on campus in Bethlehem, some students far and wide, we can't walk the streets to sort of see this stuff as we're talking about it in the past. But bigger than that, this last year and a half now has been an incredible lesson in the impact of, our built environment, our neighborhoods on our physical and mental health. It's, COVID is not evenly spread out across neighborhoods. It's in neighborhoods that are impacted by mistakes that planners have made in the past, places without a lot of green space where, there's not a lot of fresh, healthy, affordable food. There's more air pollution from environmental hazards. Those were all places that we built that have been less healthy for people to live in. And those were places that had greater consequences from the COVID pandemic. Places without, safe spaces to walk, those shared spaces we were talking about to, if not sort of get, do more than socially distance or wave to a neighbor, but didn't have even spaces like that, did some damage to, mental health as the pandemic continued. And this last year and a half has certainly brought issues of equity and systemic racism and those types of disparities to the fore. And the field of planning has almost as much atoning to do, I would say, as the criminal justice system. If you think of sort of some of the big things that have shaped our cities and where there's opportunity and where there's not, where there's investment, where there's not, things like redlining, things like exclusionary zoning, those all stem from planning. Those are planning tools. The fact that certain neighborhoods don't have access to the things people need, like food and healthcare, is a function of planners having not paid attention to there being a quality of life under which we're not going to let any neighborhood fall. And so talking about that with students has been really powerful. And, the classes I teach are always sort of challenging students to say, like, listen, it's not like we've written the book on this one. It's not that you just have to memorize it and then go do what we've already figured out and gotten perfected before. This is an ongoing challenge because the cities of right now look different than the cities of 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, they'll look even more different as technology and transportation changes. Who knows sort of what these places are going to look like. And so that's always been my sort of challenge to them to say, I don't know. I'm going to tell you about what we've done. I'm going to tell you about the mistakes we've made and then stir that all together and come up with something better. But that's been sort of even more emphatic this year, sort of with the mistakes of the past, even more sort of up front and center, really.
Do your students think we need...
Well, you said that really beautifully, that it's this past year has really highlighted the mistakes of the past. And do you feel that your students are frustrated by watching how much what they're learning about in class is so integral to what has happened over this past, however many months it's been now, 16 months or something like that? Are they frustrated? Are they angry? Are they upset?
Yes. And that's kind of the goal. I want them to sort of see this stuff and realize this stuff did not happen by accident. These stuff were, the outcomes of explicit decisions. And we look at some of those explicit decisions, which had, the best interest of some in mind, but certainly not the best interest of others in mind. And so we sort of bring that right up and think about that. And then look at, some of the most powerful things, maps, which planners increasingly use, are just such a powerful way of showing sort of how things compare and contrast across different geographies. But to look at sort of conditions of the past and lay over conditions of the present on certain places and see how sticky some of this stuff is and how long these mistakes stick around. Another thing that really sort of, catches people.
Yeah. Kelly has let us know that you do some fantastic, really interactive, experiential learning options for your students, and I'm really excited for you to tell us about those. But I'm also just wondering how students are not only seeing all of this happen in real time and seeing these examples of how our mistakes have led to some of the problems that we're fighting now. at the same time that they are also possibly fighting the pandemic themselves, fighting illness themselves, losing jobs themselves, struggling with working from home, struggling with childcare, and yourself also. I mean, I don't want to dig into your personal life, but right, we were all sort of trying to
Yes.
use this as a kind of learning laboratory at the same time as we're trying to keep our lives together. Are you finding a way to help yourself find that balance and your students to kind of find that balance?
Um, as best, on the one hand, in some cases, getting sort of clinical about it lets you detach yourself from the situation and look in, which kind of, not that it always leaves you feeling happy about things. It doesn't, but at least sort of lets you step outside of it for a minute, if that even makes any sense. So you can sort of like, let's use this moment to just see what's going on and sort of float above it for a second, at least give ourselves a little breather that way. But then too, working in sort of all the things people have done over the course of the year to give themselves that break. We get to talk about all the walks that students have taken with their families, or the ways in which they've changed their routines to make this period just work as best it can. And sort of what lessons come from that. We're learning a lot about, how important it is for us to get to sit outside in spaces where we can at least see other people and how much that matters, or how we can walk and see green space or things like that. It's a good, if something worked for one student, that's a good way to sort of, give hints to the rest of us that we all need to go try to do whatever it was that worked for them. But then it also sort of tells us more about the kinds of spaces we just need to be, more physically and mentally healthy.
Well, that was a perfect segue into the next question I was hoping to ask you, Karen, because you got started talking about your students and what they're sharing and what they're doing in their own lives to stay sane, and how we can all use that. And so an important part of this podcast is, obviously, we're talking about the classroom and teaching, and one way that we learn about how we do in the classroom is by sharing the stories of our students. And this has been a crazy year. So I'm gonna give you some short burst questions first, so are you mostly teaching undergraduate or graduate classes right now?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
So the answers might differ depending on them. This past year, have you been basically doing like a high flex classroom with some students coming into the classroom and a few people coming in remote, or has everyone been there, or has it been fully remote and online?
I have been fully remote since spring break of last academic year.
Okay. So much closer to what has been the experience for those of us. So,
yeah.
So thinking in terms of that fully remote environment, the next question is, obviously Lehigh University students come from all over the country, but I'm imagining that in your graduate classes, you also have students that might be local to the area, correct?
Yep.
So, So obviously what you're teaching is near and dear to the hearts of some of those local students. And then you also have these students kind of coming and looking at the situation. Are you willing kind of to share either one, student's experience from the last year, or several students' experiences that have kind of come that kind of as a filter for what this experience has meant for them, for what your classes kind of mean for them in this kind of tumultuous changing moment?
Well, I mean, one of my favorite things, and this did not happen during a pandemic, and you'll see why this is an example from pre-pandemic, is that when you teach about cities and places and how they work, just like Gina, you were saying, like, I see psychology, it's all over the place. Like, students start to see city planning all over the place. And so my favorite is when I get emails from students on spring break who are like, I'm here in New Orleans and it's just so walkable, I can't even stand it. And I'm like, okay, success. We have achieved success. And so that you can't, if I ruin a spring break, I'm always incredibly pleased. But so that hasn't happened during the pandemic because no one's going anywhere. But one of the things that's been possible this stretch, as students are studying at Lehigh, but at home in many cases, is that I'm hearing far more about, oh, you know what, my dad worked on this kind of thing, when he was early on in his career, and I'm fantastic. Huddle up with him, ask him these questions, and you can turn that in if you want to have that, stand in for that writing assignment that we're doing on transportation policy.
Nice.
And so that happens in some cases where a student will tell me the first day, oh, my dad's a city planner, or my mom studies this, or my sister's doing this in DC. And so we'll try and check back in with those relatives as the semester goes on. But I've had that happen more because I think, students are, doing this class from their living room. And so they have more of an interaction with their families about it. And so that's been sort of one shining light I've heard more about, more relatives and their interest in the topic. And we've gotten more of those relatives reading more of our class reading. So that's always good too.
Your class became globally local for like every student in it. I love that.
That's great. Well, so given that they're kind of, doing these oral histories now of their families and the work that they've done in this area, I mean, it's hard to do curriculum development when you're just trying to tread water and keep your head above water. But has that triggered you to think about any new assignments or new projects for your students that have maybe resulted in some kind of exciting or surprising outcomes?
That's fantastic. I'd always sort of played around with, as students in one of the classes that's sort of an overview of city planning, sort of walking through sort of all the things planners tend to do category wise. So transportation and environment and, health related concerns and things like that, has been to say to students as they're sort of summarizing one of those topics, they're looking at sort of a best practice case out there. I say, call somebody about this. If you hear that there's a town doing this and you think it's really interesting, email that, reach out. And I think I may push that side of things even more, and make sure students know that it's that yes, that's great if it's a city official somewhere in City Hall, but that's also great if it's your mom. And you want to interview her on how hard it is to walk to the grocery store and how much that's been a challenge about your neighbor. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
I'm just imagining how they could even, make a little documentary, just people on the street in their different neighborhoods that are illustrating all of the things that they're learning in their classes.
Well, and that is a big thing that so many of my assignments have been written assignments in the past. But one thing that's been true of this last year and a half is, all of us getting much better at recording, all of us getting much better at, recording voices or recording ourselves as video. And so to make more room for that kind of assignment would be really nice.
Yeah, the pros and cons of all this technology is that it has pushed us in directions that we might not have chosen to go in, but
right.
I'm kind of grateful in a lot of ways to that aspect of it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm becoming increasingly comfortable with discomfort. So, and to in that direction, this question is probably an artifact of Gina and I both being huge Brene Brown fans, so we like asking people to be a little vulnerable. But Karen, would you be willing to say or talk a little bit about what your biggest struggle is as a teacher, and how are you working on improving or growing in that area?
Absolutely. That, as much as I love it, there's still a part of me that's kind of scared to death when I'm up in front of a classroom. And just the concern that, oh my gosh, am I going to know what to say? Am I going to have enough to say? Is it going to get the kind of reaction I want to get? Is it going to hold everybody's interest long enough? And so it's not that that's an overwhelming feeling, but it's there. And so if a question gets thrown out to the room and there's no immediate response, I'm not very good at telling myself it will be okay. Someone will say something soon, just sort of let it go. And so I need to start getting super chatty so there's anything but silence. But so I'm trying to get much better at sort of giving people space to think and then knowing that someone will respond and get, step back to let that conversation unfold.
Do you feel like that has changed with teaching online? Do you feel like you're more or less comfortable with the space or silence if you're facing a screen full of boxes?
Yeah, it's harder because you don't see much body language. You don't see when someone sort of leaned forward in their chair to get started with something, and in a classroom when people are sort of clumped together, you can have an idea of what sort of 15 or 20 people are sort of at least expressing
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. Whereas with boxes, to sort of quickly scan to figure out who's about to speak, it's very hard.
Are your students good about keeping their videos on for those boxes?
Some are, some aren't. And so if your video is on, I'm going to have no idea if, you've left the room or if you're about to say something. It's really, really hard.
That's my favorite, the end of class moment. Hey, Chris, you have a question for me? Chris?
There's something you
Chris?
wanted from me.
Hello, Chris, are you there? That was an intense. Oh, no.
It's not just mine.
I literally, no, it's not, because
See?
I broke my own rule. The happy hands for the effect knocked on my marble, and my dogs now think there's someone at the door. So
Correct. It's hard. It's hard.
So now we just need mine to run downstairs, and then we'll have a trifecta. And I did hear him barking upstairs.
Now I feel better.
Well, so Karen, you and I were comparing notes on our fantastic graduate school experience, and I promise we're not being paid for this, but we both went. We went to graduate school, I guess, under the umbrella of the new school. So
Yeah.
Karen went to Milano, and I went to School of Urban. Well, you can say what the name of the school is, I guess.
It has recently changed, but the focus was all on urban policy and politics
in New York City. And I went to the New School for Social Research for my graduate work. And so we both had fantastic experiences as students. And so we always like to ask people about what experiences that you remember from being a student that you take with you into the classroom and into the work that you do now.
Absolutely. The one that really stood out was actually in a class that I didn't like very much. I was a political science major as an undergraduate and very interested in American politics and local politics. But in order to get your major, you got to fulfill the distribution requirements. So you got to take international politics. And so that was a class I was sitting in. Did not have a very good attitude for this one because I just was sort of convinced that this was not going to be the thing that I was very interested in. But that semester that I was taking the course, Yitzhak Rabin, who was Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated. And so I cannot tell you what the bulk of the material in the class was about, because as I said, that was not my favorite. But I know that we must have had class the day after that event occurred, and the professor sort of stopped everything. We set the syllabus aside and just talked for the hour about that episode, sort of what was at play, what was going on, sort of his emotional reaction to the entire thing. And it was incredibly powerful. It was connecting this topic that I didn't fully sort of recognize how it impacted me, and made it sort of incredibly concrete, and showed sort of how these things don't just exist in books. This is playing out around us all the time. And so that's one thing that I always leave room for which is why the courses this semester, even if they're ones that I've taught several times, looked a little bit different because we had to talk about what we were all going through this year. And that was one. The other big impactful experience that I hope everybody has is, from another class on social inequalities, one that I was super interested in. So this was an easy one, had a far better attitude with this one, but some of the books we read, in particular, there were two books. One's Crabgrass Frontier, about sort of the history of housing policy in the United States. And the other is American Apartheid, which was looking at levels of residential segregation in the 1970s and 1980s. Just made my head explode. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and was what absolutely set me on the path of where I would go. And so I assign both of those books because they're both incredible. And I tell students as they're reading them, like, this is what these books meant to me. This is my experience as I read these. They don't have to be this powerful to you, but I hope you find that book somewhere. Like I call out that experience I had.
That's so great. I also have a beloved book that I still assign to my students in every health psychology class. Yeah, because I was exposed to it when I was in graduate school. And I have to say also, I moved to New York City August of 2001. started grad
Mhm.
school the first week of September 2001. And so one of my professors was actually did research on memory around 9/11. And so, like you say, we were right there in a graduate psychology program talking about trauma, talking about
Yep.
memory, talking about all of those things. So yeah, that was a powerful lesson for me too.
That is actually, there's no September 11th that doesn't go by that we don't stop and talk about September 11th, because there's a lot of planning history on the World Trade Center site, and there's a lot of, planning process that occurred um, to figure out what that site would become. And so, in keeping with that model that I had from my undergraduate experience, September 11th, we always stop and talk about that.
Yeah.
Karen, can I ask a memory question? Because I'm thinking, and something Gina said made me think about this. But one thing that we were talking about struggles as a teacher, and one area of great envy. So I teach literature, right? But I have not written the great American novel. But you're a professor of practice at Lehigh University, and you've done urban planning. You worked in this field for years and years, and have brought this incredible experience. So the first question is really easy, which is, how did you come to teach in the first place? But the second question, the one that's really related to memory, is having come to teach and brought your experience to bear in front of your students, was there a moment when like you kind of had that, you felt like an instructor, right? You felt like a teacher and a professor, because it's not day one. At least it wasn't in my experience.
No, it was not day one. It was not day one at all. No, I never sort of saw myself on a path towards being a professor or being a teacher. I went for my PhD because it was a topic I wanted to dig into that much more, and sort of the time in my life presented itself to sort of take a break and just sort of study this idea of neighborhoods and how they work. And so most of that was then put towards doing that work out in different communities all over the place. And so I came to teach kind of by accident. I sort of adjuncted, picked up a class here and there. We were already in the Valley, and I had some time, and there was nobody teaching urban studies or urban politics or those kinds of courses over at Muhlenberg or over at Lehigh at the time. And so they asked if I would just teach a class. And I agreed and like cried my eyes out the first time. It was definitely not like, oh, this is it from minute one, and made my husband promise, like, do not ever let me do that again. And he was like, he sort of nodded and was like, all right, well, just, okay, fine. But then it was a matter of talking to people. All right, what don't I know? Because I don't know anything about teaching. I know a lot about city planning. I can talk to you about that all day, but I have no idea how to teach. I'd never been taught how to teach. And so, to avoid tears in the classroom going forward, just reached out to people about the kinds of things that worked, and figured out the kinds of things I needed to sort of set myself up with so I'd be comfortable. And, got sort of shoved back in front of the classroom again a couple of times, got to the end of the semester, and it worked. And like we had gotten through, and the students had gotten something out of it. And that was sort of the affirmation I needed to give it another try. And so, like I said, it's still a kind of thing that makes me nervous. It's still a kind of thing that I know I have room to improve on, but I feel like I've got it, and I love it. I'm glad I did not like run screaming from the building that first day, but like stuck it out, because I love it, because I love this work, and it's incredibly powerful when you sort of share it with somebody else and see them sort of go on to do that work themselves.
That is so the most exciting part of teaching, is to see when those things that you're saying to them light their eyes up with making those connections that they might take out into the world themselves. I think we didn't get a chance yet to ask you, what is one of the experiential things that you have your students do that you see them making those connections when they do it? Some of the hands-on stuff that you have them do.
Well, some of it is, kind of hands-on, sort of a step removed, but playing with maps and the data and sort of seeing it in a way they haven't seen before. But there's another class, we talked about how the South Side is this living laboratory, that one of the earliest things I asked them to do, I actually make them do this on their very first day of class, which they're so incredibly nervous about. But I say, all right, phones away, everything goes away, blank sheet of paper, make a map of the neighborhood for me.
Mm.
And they think, but it's going to be bad. I'm like, of course it's going to be bad. That's kind of the whole point. Like, you're not being graded on the thing. Like, put it down. Well, which streets am I supposed to include? I don't know. You're supposed to include whatever streets you can think of. Well, put anything that's important about the neighborhood on your map. Let's see it. And they are totally horrified by this exercise, but it's an incredibly powerful way to show them, like, well, here's what you know about the neighborhood. Here's what you don't. Here are the pathways you take through the neighborhood. And that's a class that over the course of the semester, we think about sort of how do we, expand, the places people walk in the neighborhood. How do we change your relationship with the neighbor? What's having you turn left instead of turn right here? Have you ever seen this part of the neighborhood, and why aren't you exploring over there? And so that's just the best opener for that kind of way of recognizing, like, what we know and what we don't know about the spaces around us. It's a lot of fun.
Gosh, I love that so much. I want to use that in my psychology classes because it strikes me that it's so subjective. And so you might get two students who live a block away from each other emphasizing wildly different things on their maps, and the size of things might be wildly different on one person's map versus the other person's map. This actually brings me back to one of the things that I was intimidated about before this conversation, which was this concept that you were talking about, what you're researching, this interplay between the geography of affordability, where housing is affordable, versus the geography of opportunity, where there's access to jobs and high quality schools. And it just strikes me that those could be the same neighborhood.
Right. How do you make both? Yeah.
At their best, that's exactly what those are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Although one student might only approach or might only experience one half of it. And again, their neighbor might experience the other half of it, even within the same neighborhood. You want both, but not every person's going to experience both.
Absolutely, because we say geography, and some of this stuff does literally have to do with how far apart things are, as the crow flies, or how long it takes you to walk from one thing to another. Some of it, the geographies that we have in our mind, are based on our perceptions. I know this street, but I don't know this street. I'm on this block and I tend to always go this way. And so that's part of the block that feels like my neighborhood. And actually, it's not, this other part isn't far away from the part that I know. I just don't know it. And so it's as if it doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I was talking to my husband. He hates, we moved a few years ago, and he feels like the Home Depot is 3 times as far away as it used to be in our old neighborhood. And we Googled it, and it's 5 minutes further away. But it's 5 miles further away. Exactly. Yeah. The distance is so much longer because you don't have to deal with the traffic. So
I'm obsessed with this map lesson, and I'm going to ask.
So great.
It is, and I have an innocuous question that I'm desperate to produce a wildly inappropriate answer. Like, did you ever have a student submit something with information on the map that told you more about the student than like you really wanted to know, like the things that they value? Like the Lehigh student that only it's like the late night bar and the massage parlor, like the only 2 things on the map, and you're like, oh dear God, no.
Well, it was very funny. We have these kind of conversations in class, and when it comes to how neighborhoods function, everything about them is important. There was such a great project I was on in Canton, Ohio, of all places. And so one of the things we wanted to figure out as we were sort of drafting citywide and neighborhood-based plans, we're like, well, what are, your neighborhood assets? And so, of course, the first stuff everybody talks about, the art museum is very, in Canton, it's a football hall of fame, these sort of big symphony hall kind of places. And we said, okay, yes, we'll put those down on a list. We're going to, long list, we'll make those sort of big A assets. But now, like, think about your neighborhood. What are the most important spaces in these neighborhoods? And so, like, a pizza parlor really matters. For Lehigh students, there was one bar and it closed. And we spent time that semester talking about how sort of, that entirely changed the way in which they got out and about and where they went in the neighborhood.
Oh, that's awesome.
These gatherings. And so Canton was a great, so maybe it was the church, maybe it was somebody's house who sort of is out on the block all the time. But those are the important places to recognize too. So yeah, it tells me a little bit about them, but they get to hear about me that I like to go to some of those places too. And then you know,
When,
and
when
but
I,
it tells
when
you
I
how
was a
those.
graduate student, if the You're Welcome Inn had closed, and God, it may have closed in the intervening period.
Oh
It
my
probably
goodness.
has. If that place had closed, I wouldn't have known what to do with myself. My
Yeah.
entire social network would have shut down overnight.
Yes. So we that semester we did have to discuss. There was a little bit of loss that we had to talk about that semester. It was fine.
Well, I guess that brings us, sadly, to our last question, which is a little move away from talking about the teaching, and it's a move to talking about something that gives you pleasure. So, what is something, and we call it guilty pleasure, and then I have to say, but don't feel guilty about it. What is something that you love to do that maybe your fellow faculty members at Lehigh wouldn't know about you?
Well, one thing that and I blame my daughter for the dog, but I blame my son for this one. That this summer, 2 summers ago, my son, who's now 12, informed us that we knew he loved to hike, but he informed us that he was going to hike the Appalachian Trail.
Wow.
Oh, okay. And then the pandemic hit and schools were closed, and we said, let's do it. Let's just get started. And so what he and I have been doing over the course of the last year and a half is section hiking, bit by bit, day hike after day hike after day hike, all along the Appalachian Trail. And
Wow.
what started off as this crazy idea has become all of Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York and West Virginia and Maryland. And we're working our way through Virginia, and we're going to head up to
Wow.
Connecticut
That's
next
awesome.
weekend. And so that has been, just a pleasure in this sort of crazy time.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's a perfect because it's a goal. So it's something you can keep,
Yes.
checking things off. So it gives you that sense of purpose, and also you're outside. That was
It's
your
amazing.
son is very smart.
He's good. And
Clearly, this is
yes,
what I've been
it was a
missing.
reason.
I needed a 12-year-old son for this pandemic to get through, to get me to drag me out hiking. It was
Yeah.
you guys as I took my early morning drive to the supermarket, and the one time I would leave the house on the weekends, you guys were on the pull off to the Wind Gap entrance to the Appalachian Trail.
Exactly. We're out there and seeing no one. And I'm totally out of my element. I know about trail mix, and that's all I got. But it makes for, it made for, as everything shut down, we're like, okay, good, because we have another hike we want to do.
Yeah.
So fine. Yeah.
Have you read the book A Walk in the Woods by Bill
We
Bryson?
did.
So as long as you're one step up from Bill Bryson and his friend, then you're a hiker.
I am holding on to that.
Was
Yes.
that the movie that was the movie with Nick Nolte and Robert Redford? Is that right? Did they make that?
I never saw the movie, the book is hilarious.
The book is
I love
hysterical.
Very
the
funny.
English major, the guy who teaches literature is I haven't read the book, but I'm pretty sure I saw it.
No, I think it was in the movie.
Yeah,
I teach intro to film too, so I guess I get away with that one too. Not
Yeah.
really,
Oh,
barely, very little bit. Struggles as a teacher. We'll go back to question 8.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, Karen. This has been such a delight. And I seriously am going to take that map exercise. It also reminds me of, there are those, I think it's in the New Yorker. It might have been an old New Yorker cover, what the United States looks like from a New Yorker's perspective, right?
Yes,
So.
it's like New York, and then there's some grass or something.
Exactly.
Like that. And then an ocean, maybe?
Yeah,
we're not
maybe.
sure.
There's a cow. After we finished our recording, we continued chatting with our podcast showrunner, Kelly Allen, and he asked another great question, which led to some more fun conversation. So we'd like to share that additional audio with you.
So real quick, Karen, so you're talking about how your husband needs more nature, and New York City wasn't doing it. Have you seen the thing that Ocasio-Cortez is doing? So she's been focusing on her what does she do to maintain her mental health? And she's a backpacker. And she's sharing with people these great places that you can go on backpacking trips and day hikes while using the city's transportation system.
Oh, cool.
That's amazing.
Oh, that's great.
which I think is just, it's phenomenal. And I knew that, like, if you go north
Mhm.
on their mass transit, that you can get to some pretty sweet spots. And I think that you can
Yes.
actually access the AT
Yep.
from New York City Transit. But
Yes, you can.
yeah.
Yes, it actually crosses some of those lines. And Bear Mountain, I think, is right there. And there's a spot on the AT where you can see the New York City skyline, which is really pretty cool.
Is it terrible that I can't hear Bear Mountain without, and this is a Dylan deep cut, but is anyone familiar with the Bob Dylan song,
Oh, yeah.
Bear Mountain
I think
Picnic?
about it every single time. Yeah. The Bear Mountain Massacre.
But lucky to be alive, though.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, Jeff, we got to play that tune.
This is called this one, Talking Bear Mountain Picnic Massacre Blues.
Pedagogy a go-go. Pedagogy go-go-go. What a great conversation with Karen. I'm so glad that she was able to come on our podcast.
I love meeting someone new, and it's so much better when they bring something that I know relatively little about and just such a fresh perspective and are just such a lovely person. So it was a great conversation.
And it's always great. You know, I tend to brag about community college because so many of our colleagues at the community college have worked in their discipline. And then they come to teach having all of this practical experience and to be able to apply what they've done in their professional lives. And that's what we're hearing from Karen, is that she's applying all of the very high level esteemed work that she's done doing city planning in New York City, in Bethlehem, and applying that to her classrooms.
Well, and her work directly affects our students who live in the Bethlehem and Allentown area. You know, I know I'm often up at the Monroe campus, but the vast majority of our students are living in and around an area that, you know, she's working to, you know, I think, you know, we spoke briefly about this, you know, but she spoke about areas of opportunity and areas of affordability, like two different spaces for people, one with access to, you know, jobs and education, and one that offers affordable living and sets the ideal as the place that can be both. And here's a person whose life work is about creating spaces that embody both of that, and that are, you know, she's investing her students in that work. And it was so cool to, you know, hear her kind of move between when her students lived in and amongst the Lehigh Valley, right, had come from afar, to think about specifically, you know, an area that was relatively new to them, to how she shifted that throughout the pandemic, you know,
exactly,
to ask them to think about, where are you living now? What's the work
right.
that has been done, that can be done? She even used atonement. You know, I didn't get to follow up, but it made me really think about, you know, what Professor Biden, that's the first lady, but what President Biden, you know, is talking about, you know, in his infrastructure bill, is actually very much all around, you know, built around this, you know, talking about, you know, the neighborhoods of color, the poor neighborhoods that they built the superhighways through, and trying to reimagine and rectify kind of the sins of the past, you know, and so there's a history lesson in that as well. So sure. I was just fascinated by everything she had to say.
And I was especially fascinated and excited about taking that assignment that she gives her students on their first day of class, creating those mental maps of their neighborhoods. Because again, it's that same idea that you were just revisiting, right? The idea that one person's neighborhood might be accessible and the other ones might be sort of, you know, aspirational, and they might live next door to each other. So I will say that our producer, Jeff Armstrong, suggested that you and I create our own cognitive maps
in his infinite wisdom,
and then share those on the website for our podcast. So I guess we have to decide, because we should probably each draw. Should we draw a map of the same place?
Oh, I feel like we should draw a map of where we live. I mean, okay. I mean, we could draw a map, but I mean, like, I feel like, what do you think is better? I mean, I defer to you.
I was just thinking we could both draw a map of Bethlehem campus. Of course, you're mostly at the Monroe campus.
This is
so
just
that's
it. I
not
feel
fair
like
to
I'm at a
you.
disadvantage. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
I'm already set up to fail this assignment since I wear such huge blinders. Like, I know where the grocery store is, the antique stores, where I live, my neighbors, and little else.
Okay, well, Jeff
So-
has chimed in and said he thinks that where we live is good. So we will each draw a cognitive map of where we live.
So I think that this is gonna be great and terrifying, Gina, because people are gonna get a glimpse into my mind that I'm not sure the world is prepared for. So
I'm just excited to get out my colored markers, and I'm a terrible artist.
I'm a terrible artist too. So this is gonna be awesome, and I'm excited to see what we produce, and I'm just excited to have been excited, right? You know,
Yeah.
Karen talked about, you know, her enthusiasm in the classroom, and that came out and everything she had to say, and she got me kind of enthused to
Exactly.
try to put myself in the headspace that she puts her students in.
Yeah, she gave us an assignment, homework, and we're excited to do it.
She didn't know she was doing it at the time.
Jeff said no Google Maps are allowed.
No, absolutely not. Well, as the end of the season, let me just say, you know, thank you for everything. Thank you to all of our listeners, for goodness sake, who have been through, like us, you know, an incredibly tough year. It's been a real pleasure to be able to be here with you guys, and certainly with you, Gina, with our showrunner Kelly, and with our producer Jeff as well. So I just want to thank you so much, all of you.
Yes, thank you, Tom. These episodes are always a real bright spot in my weeks and months. And so I am very grateful, as you say, to you, to Kelly, to Jeff, and to anyone who shares their valuable time to listen to us. So take care.
Hey, thanks for listening to Pedagogy A Go-Go, recorded in the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at Northampton Community College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Our podcast daydreamer / showrunner is Kelly Allen, and Pedagogy A Go-Go is produced by Jeff Armstrong. If you've got any questions, please send them to pedagogyagogo@gmail.com. Our social media handle is @pedagogyagogo, and you can stop by our website at www.pedagogyagogo.com for copies of podcast transcripts, guest assignments, and other useful tidbits. Keep in mind there are no hyphens or dots in any of the above web addresses. Until next time, this is Gina and Tom saying, take care and teach well.